The conference room smelled of leather and old wood, the kind of scent that belonged to money that had been around long enough to develop its own gravity. I sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, my hands folded in my lap, watching dust particles drift through the afternoon light slanting in from the tall windows overlooking downtown Richmond. Across from me, my brother Blake lounged in his chair like he owned not just the room but the entire building, his expensive watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist. My father James sat rigid beside him, his jaw set in that familiar expression of barely contained impatience. Diane, his second wife, kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her designer dress, her lips pressed into a thin line of calculation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mr. Gregory Bennett, my grandfather's attorney for the past 30 years, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. The sound cut through the silence like a gavel, and I felt my pulse quicken. This was it. The moment when everything would be formalized, written in legal language, made permanent. The moment when my family would finally have documentation of what they had always believed, that I didn't matter enough to be remembered. Blake leaned toward my father and whispered something I couldn't quite catch, but the smirk on his face told me everything I needed to know. Diane tilted her head, listening, then let out a soft laugh that she tried to disguise as a cough. My father's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward me for just a second, and in that glance I saw something I had seen my entire life. Dismissal. The casual erasure of my existence, as easy as turning a page. Mr. Bennett opened the thick folder before him. The will of Walter Harrison, my grandfather, the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen something worth nurturing. My throat tightened. I wanted to be anywhere but here, sitting in this room with people who had spent decades teaching me that love was a finite resource, and I simply hadn't earned enough of it to warrant a share. The lawyer began to read, his voice steady and professional, but I barely heard the opening paragraphs. Legal language washed over me like white noise while my mind drifted back through the years, through every moment that had brought me to this chair, to this room, to this final proof that I had been right all along. I was the afterthought, the footnote, the child who had somehow failed to be remarkable enough to deserve a place at the table. Blake shifted in his seat, and I caught him glancing at his phone under the table. He wasn't even pretending to pay attention. Why would he? He already knew what was coming. They all did. This was just a formality, a legal requirement before they could divide up my grandfather's estate and move on with their lives, unencumbered by the memory of the granddaughter, who had never quite measured up. But then Mr. Bennett said something that made Blake's head snap up. My father leaned forward. Diane's hand froze mid-smoothing, and I felt the air in the room change, thicken, charge with an electricity that made every hair on my arm stand up. The lawyer looked directly at me, his expression unreadable behind those wire-rimmed glasses, and I knew that whatever came next would shatter the careful narrative my family had constructed about who I was and what I was worth. The dust particles continued their lazy dance through the sunlight, but everything else had suddenly stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped pretending that this was just another ordinary afternoon in a lawyer's office in Richmond, Virginia. The first time I understood that I was different from Blake, I was 7 years old. We were at my grandfather's estate in Charlottesville, the sprawling property with its gardens and stone walls and the workshop where Grandpa Walt spent his weekends restoring antique furniture. It was Easter Sunday, and the whole family had gathered for dinner. I had spent the morning in the workshop with Grandpa, watching him sand down an old secretary desk, his hands moving with the kind of patience that made time feel irrelevant. He had let me help, guiding my small hands over the wood, teaching me to feel the grain, to understand that everything worth doing required attention and care. When we came inside for dinner, my hands were dusty and my dress had a smudge of wood stain on the hem. My mother Patricia took one look at me and sighed that particular sigh that meant I had disappointed her again. She didn't say anything, just handed me a napkin and turned her attention to Blake, who had spent the morning playing video games in the den, and looked absolutely pristine in his button-down shirt and pressed slacks. At the table, my father asked Blake about school. Blake was in 5th grade, and had just made the traveling soccer team. He talked about practices and tournaments, and my father listened with the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for business calls. He asked questions. He offered advice. He beamed with pride when Blake mentioned that the coach had called him a natural athlete. Then my father turned to me, and I straightened in my chair, ready to tell him about the science fair project I had been working on. A solar oven made from a pizza box that actually worked. I had tested it that week, and it had gotten hot enough to melt chocolate. My teacher had said it was one of the best projects she had seen in years. But before I could speak, my father said, "Emma, how are your grades?" Not what are you working on? Not what are you excited about? Just a question that reduced me to a number, a metric, a box to check. I told him I had all A's. He nodded once, said good, keep it up, and then turned back to Blake to discuss soccer strategy. That was it. The entire exchange lasted maybe 15 seconds. I sat there with my solar oven story trapped in my throat, and I looked across the table at my grandfather. He was watching me, and when our eyes met, he winked. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it said everything. I see you. You matter. Don't let them convince you otherwise. That pattern repeated itself for years. Blake made the basketball team. Blake got elected class president. Blake landed the lead in the school play. Every achievement was celebrated with dinners out and gifts and endless praise. I made the state spelling bee. I won the regional math competition. I got accepted into the National Honor Society. Each accomplishment was met with a nod. "That's nice, sweetheart." And then the conversation would shift back to Blake. By the time I was in high school, I had learned not to expect anything different. I stopped announcing my successes at the dinner table. I stopped waiting for my parents to ask about my day. I focused on my grades and my activities and spent every weekend. I could at Grandpa Walt's estate, where I was allowed to be more than just the quiet daughter, who didn't require much attention. Grandpa Walt had built his fortune in historical preservation, while my father had gone into construction and development, tearing down old buildings to make way for modern strip malls and housing developments. My grandfather had dedicated his life to saving pieces of the past. He restored historic homes. He salvaged architectural details from buildings scheduled for demolition. He taught me that everything had value if you knew how to look at it properly, even things that other people had written off as worthless. In his workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, he taught me about joinery and finish work. He showed me how to read old blueprints. He explained the difference between Greek Revival and Federal architecture. But more than that, he taught me about worth. "Emma," he said to me one Saturday afternoon while we were refinishing a Victorian sideboard, "the world is full of people who will try to tell you what you're worth. They'll try to put a price tag on you based on things that don't matter. Your job is to know your own value and never let anyone convince you to accept less." I was 14 when he said that, and I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought he was talking about negotiating salaries or standing up for myself in business deals. I didn't realize he was preparing me for the moment when my own family would try to erase me entirely. When it came time to apply for college, the difference between Blake's experience and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mine became impossible to ignore. Blake was a senior, and the entire house revolved around his college search. My parents hired a private admissions counselor. They toured campuses across the East Coast. They discussed financial aid packages and scholarship opportunities over dinner every night, weighing the merits of Duke versus Wake Forest versus Chapel Hill. I was a sophomore, already thinking about my own future, but whenever I tried to join the conversation, I was told we would deal with my college search when the time came. There was only so much attention to go around, and Blake's needs took priority. When Blake got accepted to Duke with a partial scholarship, my parents were ecstatic. They hosted a celebration dinner. They bought him a new laptop and a mini fridge for his dorm room. They told everyone they knew that their son was going to Duke. My father drove around with a Blue Devils bumper sticker on his truck for the entire summer. Then came the conversation about money. Duke was expensive, even with the scholarship. My parents sat Blake down and told him not to worry, that they would cover the difference. Room and board, meal plan, textbooks, spending money. All of it. "We want you to focus on your education," my mother said. "Not on financial stress." 2 years later, When it was my turn, the conversation was different. I had gotten into the University of Virginia, my top choice, with a partial scholarship of my own. I was excited. UVA had an excellent architecture program, and Charlottesville was close enough that I could still visit Grandpa Walt on weekends. But when I told my parents, expecting the same enthusiasm they had shown for Blake, my father frowned and asked how much the scholarship covered. I told him it covered about 60% of tuition. He nodded slowly, then said, "Well, you'll need to figure out the rest. We helped your brother, but that stretched us pretty thin. You're smart and resourceful. You'll find a way to make it work." Just like that, my education became my problem to solve. No celebration dinner. No new laptop. No promises that they would cover the difference. Just an expectation that I would handle it myself because, as my mother liked to say, I had always been independent. I sat in my bedroom that night, staring at the acceptance letter, feeling the weight of that word. Independent. They said it like it was a compliment, like they were proud of my self-sufficiency. But I knew the truth. Independence wasn't a gift they had given me. It was a condition they had imposed because investing in me had never been a priority. The next day, I went to see Grandpa Walt. I found him in the workshop, restoring an old mission-style rocking chair. I didn't cry. I had learned long ago that tears didn't change anything. I just told him what had happened, my voice flat and factual like I was reporting the weather. He set down his sandpaper and looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me." We walked through the garden to the main house, and he led me into his study. It was a room I loved, lined with bookshelves and filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that comes from a life well lived. He pulled out a leather portfolio from his desk drawer and opened it. Inside were bank statements, investment documents, and a handwritten ledger in his careful script. "I've been setting money aside for you," he said. "I started when you were born, just like I did for Blake. But unlike Blake's fund, which your father has been dipping into for years, yours is intact. It's not enough to cover all 4 years, but it'll get you through the first 2. After that, you'll need scholarships and maybe some part-time work. But Emma, you'll make it. You're going to be fine." I stared at the numbers, at the evidence that someone had been planning for my future, even when I thought no one cared. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because I wanted you to learn what it felt like to stand on your own first," he said. "Your parents have done you a disservice by making things so easy for your brother. Blake doesn't know how to struggle, and that's going to hurt him someday. But you, Emma, you know how to work for what you want. This money isn't a gift. It's a foundation. What you build on top of it is up to you." He pulled out another document, a letter of intent he had written and notarized. "When I'm gone," he said, and I started to protest, but he held up his hand. "When I'm gone, there are things I want you to have. But more than that, there are lessons I want you to remember. Your worth isn't determined by how much attention your parents give you. It's not measured by whether your brother gets a bigger bedroom or a nicer car. Your worth is inherent. It's in your curiosity and your work ethic and your refusal to become bitter even when you have every right to be." I left his house that day with a check for my first year at UVA and a promise that he would be there for me, even when no one else was. I also left with something more valuable, the understanding that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet and practical and shows up in bank statements and woodworking lessons, and a grandfather who sees you even when you feel invisible. At UVA, I discovered what it meant to build a life on my own terms. My dorm room was small, a cramped double in an old residence hall that smelled faintly of mildew and decades of student life. My roommate was a girl from Northern Virginia who went home every weekend, so most of the time I had the space to myself. I covered the walls with photographs of Grandpa Walt's restoration projects and architectural sketches I had done in high school. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I worked 3 jobs that first semester. Mornings before class, I sheltered books at the university library, sliding volumes back into their proper places while the building was still quiet and empty. Afternoons, I tutored calculus and physics in the academic support center, helping freshmen who struggled with concepts that had always come naturally to me. Evenings and weekends, I waitressed at a restaurant near the downtown mall, carrying trays of overpriced pasta to tourists and parents visiting their children. The money from Grandpa Walt covered tuition and housing, But everything else, textbooks, meals, supplies, the endless small expenses that add up when you're trying to survive on a college campus, came from those jobs. I learned to budget down to the dollar. I learned which grocery stores had the best sales and how to make a rotisserie chicken last for 6 meals. I learned to say no when classmates invited me out for drinks or weekend trips I couldn't afford. Blake, meanwhile, was living a completely different college experience. His social media posts showed a steady stream of parties, beach weekends, concerts, and spring break trips to Cancun and Miami. He joined a fraternity his freshman year, and my parents paid the dues without question. When he called home to say his car had broken down, they bought him a newer model. When he mentioned that his laptop was running slow, a new one arrived within days. I tried not to compare. I tried to focus on my own path and remember what Grandpa Walt had told me about building my own foundation. But it was hard not to feel the inequity, especially during holidays when I would come home and listen to my parents marvel at how well Blake was doing, how many friends he had made, how he was really thriving at Duke. They rarely asked about my experience. When they did, their questions were perfunctory, surface level. How are classes? Are your grades good? They never asked what I was learning or what excited me about my major. They never asked about the preservation project I was working on with one of my professors, documenting historic buildings in rural Virginia that were at risk of demolition. They never asked about the friends I had made or the life I was building. During winter break of my sophomore year, I overheard a conversation that clarified everything. I had come home for the holidays, and Blake was there too, regaling everyone with stories about his semester. I was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher after dinner, when I heard voices from the living room. My father and Diane were talking, and they didn't realize I could hear them. "We need to talk about Blake's credit card bill," Diane said. "It's getting out of hand." "How much?" my father asked. "Almost $8,000 this semester. Restaurants, bars, that ski trip he took, new clothes. James, we can't keep covering these expenses." There was a pause, and then my father said, "We'll figure it out. He's young. He's supposed to be enjoying himself." "What about Emma?" Diane asked. "She works 3 jobs and never asks for anything." "Emma is fine," my father said, and I could hear the dismissal in his voice, the same tone he had used my entire life when my name came up. "She's always been self-sufficient. She doesn't need the same level of support Blake does. He's more, I don't know, he requires more attention. Emma has always been able to handle things on her own." I stood there with a plate in my hands, water running over it, and felt something crystallize inside me. They weren't giving me less because they thought I didn't need it. They were giving me less because it was easier, because I didn't complain, because I had learned to survive on scraps, and they had interpreted my survival as preference rather than necessity. I finished loading the dishwasher in silence, dried my hands, and went upstairs to my old bedroom. It felt smaller every time I came home, the walls closing in a little more with each visit. I pulled out my laptop and looked at my bank account. After paying for spring semester textbooks and making a dent in my meal plan, I had $347 to my name. The next morning, I drove to Charlottesville to see Grandpa Walt. I found him in the workshop as usual, this time working on a cherrywood dining table that had been damaged in a house fire. He was carefully removing the charred sections, salvaging what could be saved. "Your father called me yesterday," he said without looking up from his work. "Wanted to know if I could lend Blake some money. Apparently he's gotten himself into a bit of financial trouble at school." I felt my jaw tighten. "What did you say?" I said no. He set down his tools and turned to face me. I told him that Blake is 20 years old and needs to learn that money doesn't appear out of thin air just because he wants something. I also told him that if he's so concerned about his son's finances, perhaps he should look at the choices he's made about how to allocate his resources. "I bet that went over well," I said. Grandpa Walt smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Your father hung up on me. Not the first time. Won't be the last. Emma, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me clearly. The way your parents have treated you is not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their limitations. They don't know how to love someone who doesn't demand their attention constantly. They don't know how to appreciate quiet strength because they've never developed it themselves. He pulled out a chair and gestured for me to sit. I've been thinking about the future, he continued. About what happens to all of this when I'm gone. He waved his hand, encompassing the workshop, the house, the land. Your father thinks it's all going to him. He thinks he'll sell this property to some developer, tear down the house, put up condos or a shopping center. He's been counting on that money for years. Grandpa. I started, but he shook his head. Let me finish. I've spent my life preserving things that other people wanted to destroy. This house, this land, the work I do here, it means something. And I've watched you, Emma. I've watched the way you light up when we talk about architecture and history and craftsmanship. I've seen you measure twice and cut once. I've seen you sand with the grain and take your time to do things right. You understand what this place represents. He reached into his workbench drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. I've made some changes to my will. I've been working with Mr. Bennett for the past 6 months, getting everything in order. I'm not telling you what's in here, and I'm not telling your father. But I want you to know that I see you. I've always seen you. And when the time comes, there are going to be some people who are very surprised by what they learn. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of it. You don't have to. Yes, I do, he said firmly. Because someone needs to show you that your worth isn't negotiable. Someone needs to prove to you that being quiet and capable and independent doesn't mean you deserve less. It means you've earned more. We spent the rest of that afternoon working together in comfortable silence, restoring what could be saved and letting go of what couldn't. I drove back to UVA that evening with a full tank of gas that Grandpa Walt had insisted on paying for, and a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. Junior year brought new challenges and new revelations. I declared my major in architectural history with a focus on preservation, a decision that baffled my parents when I mentioned it during a brief phone call home. What are you going to do with that? My father asked, his skepticism clear even through the phone line. There's no money in preservation. If you wanted to study architecture, you should have gone into design or development. I didn't bother explaining that preservation was exactly what I wanted, that I had found my calling in saving things that others deemed expendable. I had learned by then that my parents weren't interested in understanding my choices. They were interested in whether those choices reflected well on them. And a daughter studying an unmarketable niche field didn't generate the same dinner party conversation as a son at Duke studying business. That same semester, Blake called home in a panic. He had failed 2 classes and was on academic probation. My parents sprang into action immediately, hiring a tutor, speaking with his dean, making appointments with academic advisors. They flew to Durham twice in 1 month to support him through what my mother called his rough patch. The whole family rallied around Blake's crisis. 2 weeks later, I won a competitive research grant to spend the summer documenting threatened historic sites in Appalachia. It was a prestigious program, one that would look exceptional on graduate school applications, and could lead to publication opportunities. When I called home to share the news, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the same tone she might have used if I had told her I found a good parking spot. Then she immediately shifted the conversation to Blake's recovery plan, how he was working with a therapist now and really turning things around. I hung up and sat in my dorm room, staring at the acceptance letter from the grant committee, and felt absolutely nothing. Not pride, not excitement, not even disappointment at my mother's reaction. Just a vast emptiness where familial joy should have been. But then my phone rang. Grandpa Walt. Rosa told me to call you, he said. Rosa Martinez had been his housekeeper for 20 years, though housekeeper was an inadequate term for what she meant to him. She managed his home, certainly, but she was also his friend, his companion, his partner in the quiet life he had built for himself after my grandmother passed away. She said you'd have good news, he continued, and that your parents probably didn't react the way they should have. So I'm calling to react properly. Tell me everything. I told him about the grant, about the project, about the sites I would be documenting. He listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions, understanding immediately why this opportunity mattered. When I finished, he said, "I'm proud of you, Emma. Not just for winning the grant, but for knowing what you want and going after it even when no one else understands. That takes courage." Those words meant more to me than any celebration dinner or gift could have. They meant someone really saw me, and recognized the work I was doing. The summer research project changed my trajectory. I spent 3 months traveling through Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, photographing and documenting buildings that were on the verge of disappearing. One-room schoolhouses that had been boarded up for decades. Covered bridges that were slowly collapsing into rivers. Victorian mansions that had been divided into apartments and neglected until they were barely standing. I learned to read buildings like texts, to see the stories in their bones. A hand-hewn beam meant the structure dated to before the Civil War, when everything was built with local materials and local labor. Balloon framing indicated late 19th century construction, when lumber became cheap and standardized. Each architectural detail was a breadcrumb leading back through time. But I also learned about loss. So many of the buildings I documented were demolished within months of my visit. I would return to a site I had photographed in June only to find a pile of rubble in August. Each demolition felt personal, like watching someone erase a piece of history simply because they didn't understand its value. Near the end of the summer, I was documenting a Greek Revival mansion in a small town in southwestern Virginia. The house had been empty for 15 years, slowly deteriorating while the owner's heirs fought over what to do with it. It was magnificent even in decay, with soaring columns and elaborate plasterwork, and floors made from heart pine that would be impossible to replicate today. I was on the second floor, photographing the ceiling medallions, when I heard voices downstairs. I froze, worried I was trespassing despite having gotten permission from one of the heirs. But then I recognized one of the voices. My father. I moved quietly to the top of the stairs and listened. My father was there with a client, walking through the house, discussing demolition costs and development potential. The land is what matters, he was saying. The house is a teardown. We can have it cleared in a week, pour a foundation, and start framing the new condos by October. What about historical designation? The client asked. I thought this house was on some kind of registry. It's on a local list, nothing binding, my father said. And even if it were protected, there are ways around that. Trust me, I've done this 100 times. Preservation is just a word people use when they don't understand economics. I stood at the top of the stairs, gripping my camera, and felt something solidify inside me. This was the divide between us, clearer than any conversation we had ever had. My father built his fortune destroying the things I dedicated my life to saving. We weren't just different. We were opposed. I waited until they left, then finished my documentation with a new urgency. I took hundreds of photographs. I measured and sketched. I noted every detail I could find. Then I contacted the State Historic Preservation Office and made a case for emergency designation. I provided my research, my photographs, my architectural analysis. It took 6 weeks, but the house was granted temporary protection while the designation process moved forward. My father's development deal fell through, and when he found out who had initiated the preservation review, he called me for the first time in months. What the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded. That was a $2 million project, Emma. Do you have any idea how much money you just cost me? I saved a piece of Virginia's architectural heritage, I said calmly. That house is one of the finest examples of Greek Revival design in the region. It deserves to be preserved. It deserves to be torn down and replaced with something useful, he shot back. You're playing with things you don't understand. This is business, Emma. This is the real world. You can't just, I'm doing exactly what Grandpa Walt taught me to do, I interrupted. I'm saving things that have value even when other people are too short-sighted to see it. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was ice. You sound just like him. You know that. Stubborn and naive and completely out of touch with reality. I hope you're proud of yourself. I am, I said, and I meant it. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in my apartment, shaking but certain. I had chosen my side, and it was the right one. Even if it meant widening the gap between my father and me into something that could never be bridged. Senior year arrived with a new clarity about who I was and what I wanted. I had spent 3 years proving to myself that I could survive without my family's support, and in the process, I had discovered that survival wasn't enough. I wanted to build something meaningful, a career that mattered, A life that reflected my values rather than anyone else's expectations. I applied to graduate programs in historic preservation at some of the top schools in the country: Columbia, Penn, Tulane, and the University of Texas. My professors wrote glowing recommendations. My research from the summer had been accepted for publication in a regional history journal. My portfolio was strong. I felt, for the first time in my academic life, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Blake, meanwhile, had graduated from Duke the previous spring and moved back home. He had a business degree but no clear direction, no job, and according to my mother's occasional updates, no particular urgency about finding either. He was working for my father's company in some vague capacity that seemed to involve attending meetings and taking clients to lunch, but not much actual work. "He's learning the business," my father said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "I'm grooming him to take over eventually. Thompson Construction will stay in the family." I didn't point out that I was also part of the family, or that I had never been offered a place in the company despite my relevant education and skills. I had long since stopped expecting to be included in my father's vision of the future. In December of my senior year, I flew home for Christmas. It had been more than a year since I had been back to Richmond, and I almost didn't go. But Grandpa Walt had asked me specifically to come, had said there was something he wanted to discuss, and I could never say no to him. The house looked exactly the same when I pulled into the driveway on Christmas Eve. The same evergreen wreath on the door, the same lights strung along the roofline, the same sense that I was entering a space where I would never quite belong. Diane answered the door and greeted me with a hug that felt obligatory, her arms barely making contact before pulling away. "Emma, you look thin," she said, which was her way of expressing concern without actually offering to do anything about it. "We're so glad you could make it. Your father and Blake are in the study going over some business things. Dinner is at 6. I carried my bag upstairs to the guest room, the room that had become mine after Blake claimed the larger bedroom with the attached bathroom when we were teenagers. It was decorated in bland neutrals, impersonal as a hotel, and I set my suitcase on the bed feeling like a visitor rather than a daughter coming home. That evening, dinner proceeded exactly as I had anticipated. Blake dominated the conversation, talking about a new project my father had given him, managing the development of a mixed-use property on the outskirts of Richmond. My father listened with intense interest, offering advice and asking detailed questions. Diane contributed occasional comments about marketing and design. My mother, who had divorced my father years ago but was there for the holiday, smiled benevolently at Blake and refilled his wine glass. When there was a pause in the conversation, I mentioned that I had been accepted to Columbia's Historic Preservation Program with a full scholarship and a stipend. It was the kind of news that should have generated excitement, congratulations, questions about my plans. Instead, my father glanced at me briefly and said, "That's in New York?" "Yes," I said. "Expensive city," he remarked, then turned back to Blake. "So about the property on Broad Street, have you gotten the environmental assessments back yet?" And just like that, my future was dismissed as casually as if I had mentioned a change in the weather. I finished my meal in silence, listening to them discuss Blake's project, and felt the familiar numbness settle over me. This was my family. This was what coming home meant. A constant reinforcement that my achievements were footnotes, my plans were interruptions, my presence was tolerated but not celebrated. After dinner, I escaped to Grandpa Walt's house. I found him in the study with Rosa, the two of them sitting by the fire, classical music playing softly in the background. He stood when I entered, his face lighting up in a way my father's never had. "There she is," he said, pulling me into a real hug, the kind that meant something. "Columbia. Emma, that's extraordinary. Tell me everything." I spent the next hour telling him about the program, about the classes I would take and the thesis project I was already planning. Rosa brought us tea and settled back into her chair, listening with genuine interest as I described the buildings I wanted to study, the preservation techniques I hoped to learn, the career I envisioned for myself. "Your grandfather has something he wants to show you," Rosa said when I finally paused for breath. She looked at Walt with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that seemed almost sad despite her smile. Grandpa Walt stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a folder I recognized. It was the same leather portfolio he had shown me years ago when I was heading to UVA, the one with the bank statements and careful notations. But it was thicker now, more documents added over the years. I've been thinking about legacy, he said, settling back into his chair. About what we leave behind and who we trust to carry it forward. Your father thinks he knows what I'm going to do with this estate. He's been making assumptions for years, planning how he'll liquidate everything the moment I'm gone. He's even approached developers about the property, showed them surveys and zoning maps, made promises about what will be available. I felt a chill run through me despite the warmth of the fire. Grandpa, you don't have to talk about this. Yes, I do, he said firmly. Because you need to understand what's coming. When I'm gone, there's going to be a reckoning. Your father has built his entire financial strategy around an inheritance he's not going to receive, not the way he expects. And when he finds out, he's going to be angry. He's going to blame you. Why would he blame me? I asked, though somewhere deep down, I already knew the answer. Because I'm leaving almost everything to you, Walt said simply. The house, the land, the workshop, the investments. All of it. There will be something for your father and for Blake, enough to be fair but not enough to waste. But the bulk of my estate, everything that matters, goes to you. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. I can't, Grandpa, that's not. It's exactly right, he interrupted. Emma, you're the only one who understands what this place means. You're the only one who would preserve it rather than destroy it. I've spent my life saving pieces of history, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let your father tear down my life's work the moment I'm in the ground. Rosa reached over and took my hand. He's been planning this for a long time, Mija. It's what he wants. It's what's right. But the family, I stammered. Dad will never forgive me. Blake will think I manipulated you. They'll say I influenced you, that I took advantage. Let them say whatever they want, Walt said. The truth is documented. Mr. Bennett has files going back a decade showing my intentions, my reasoning, my complete mental competency. No one can contest this will, Emma. It's airtight. But I need you to be prepared for what happens when it's read. Your father is going to show you who he really is, and it's not going to be pleasant. I sat there in his study, surrounded by books and restored furniture, and the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent 83 years learning how to see value where others saw only profit margins. And I felt terrified. Not of the inheritance itself, but of what it would mean. The final, irrevocable proof that I had never belonged in my father's house, that I had always been different, separate, other. I don't want you to die, I said, and my voice cracked on the words. I know, sweetheart, he said gently, but we don't get to choose the timing. What we get to choose is how we face it, and what we leave behind. I'm leaving you the tools to build the life you want, free from anyone else's expectations. That's all I ever wanted for you. I stayed at his house until late that night, reluctant to return to my father's sterile guest room, and the family that had never felt like home. When I finally did go back, the house was dark except for a light still burning in the study. I could see my father's silhouette through the window, hunched over his desk, probably reviewing contracts or planning his next development project. He didn't look up as I walked past. The rest of the holiday was a study in painful civility. We exchanged gifts on Christmas morning, my family going through the motions of celebration, while I felt like a ghost at my own funeral. Blake gave me a generic gift card to a chain restaurant. My father and Diane gave me a book about career planning that felt more like a criticism than a present. My mother gave me a scarf she had clearly picked up at the last minute from a department store clearance rack. I had brought thoughtful gifts for everyone, books I had carefully selected based on their interests, or at least the interests I imagined they had since I didn't really know them anymore. The gifts were received with polite thanks and immediately set aside, forgotten before the wrapping paper was even cleaned up. The day after Christmas, I went back to Grandpa Walt's house and didn't leave until it was time to drive back to UVA. We spent those days working in the workshop together, restoring a set of dining chairs that had been in storage for months. He taught me a new technique for repairing split spindles, and we talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they know time is precious but don't want to acknowledge why. On my last evening there, as I was getting ready to leave, Rosa pulled me aside in the kitchen. He's not doing well, she said quietly. His heart. The doctors have told him he has maybe a year, probably less. He didn't want to tell you and ruin your holidays, but I think you should know. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the world suddenly unstable. A year? If he's lucky, she said, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. He's made his peace with it, Emma. He's gotten everything in order. But he's going to need you to be strong when the time comes. Your father is going to make this hard. You're going to need to remember everything your grandfather taught you about knowing your worth. I drove back to UVA in a daze, my mind cycling through denial and grief and a premature sense of loss that made it hard to breathe. I called Grandpa Walt every week that spring, long conversations where we talked about my classes and his projects and carefully avoided discussing his health. But I could hear it in his voice, the way he tired more easily, the way conversations that used to last an hour now lasted 20 minutes before he needed to rest. I graduated from UVA in May, walking across the stage to receive my diploma with my professors cheering and my classmates applauding. My parents didn't come. My father said he had an important business meeting he couldn't reschedule. Blake said he had plans he couldn't change. My mother sent a card with a check for $50 and a note saying she was proud of me, though the generic phrasing suggested she had no idea what I had actually studied or accomplished. But Grandpa Walt was there. He sat in the audience with Rosa beside him, and when my name was called, he stood and applauded louder than anyone else in that stadium. After the ceremony, he took me to dinner at the nicest restaurant in Charlottesville, just the three of us, and we celebrated properly. He gave me a gift, a restored architect's desk that had belonged to a 19th century builder in Richmond, complete with original drawings still tucked in the drawers. Every craftsman needs the right workspace, he said. This is for your new apartment in New York. A reminder that you come from a long line of people who built things that lasted. I cried then in the middle of the restaurant, not caring who saw, because this was what love looked like. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but attention and understanding and the kind of support that said I see who you are and I'm proud of what you're becoming. That summer, I moved to New York and started the graduate program at Columbia. My apartment was a tiny studio in Washington Heights, barely big enough for a bed and the architect's desk Grandpa Walt had given me. But the rent was manageable, and I could see the George Washington Bridge from my window. I set up the desk in the corner, arranged my books and drafting tools, and felt like I was exactly where I belonged. I called Grandpa Walt every Sunday. Sometimes we talked for an hour, sometimes just 15 minutes if he was having a hard day. He wanted to know everything about my classes, my professors, the buildings I was studying. He asked about the friends I was making, and whether I had started dating anyone. He never asked about my father or Blake, and I was grateful for that omission. In September, I met David Chun at a preservation conference in Brooklyn. He was a structural engineer specializing in historic buildings, and we spent 3 hours talking about load-bearing walls and foundation systems, and the challenges of updating old structures for modern building codes. He was smart and funny and genuinely excited about the same things I was excited about, and by the end of the conference, we had exchanged numbers and made plans to meet for coffee. That coffee turned into dinner, which turned into a standing date every Friday night, which turned into spending most weekends together exploring New York's architectural gems. David understood my work in a way my family never had. He celebrated my successes and supported me through my struggles, and for the first time in my life, I was in a relationship where I felt seen and valued for exactly who I was. In November, Grandpa Walt called on a Wednesday instead of Sunday. I knew immediately that something was wrong. "Emma," he said, and his voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard it. "I need you to come home. Soon. There are things we need to discuss." I took the train to Richmond the next day, my heart racing the entire journey. Rosa met me at the station, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. "He's in the hospital," she said. "His heart is failing faster than the doctors expected. He has days, maybe a week." The hospital room was too bright, too sterile, too wrong for a man who had spent his life surrounded by the warmth of wood and the patina of age. But Grandpa Walt smiled when he saw me, and for a moment, he looked like himself again. "There's my girl," he said. I pulled a chair close to his bed and took his hand. It felt fragile, the bones too prominent, the skin paper thin. "I'm here," I said. "I'm right here." I know, he said. Emma, I need to tell you something. Mr. Bennet is coming tomorrow to review the will with you. Everything is in order, but I want you to hear it from me first so you know this is what I want, not something you have to feel guilty about. Grandpa, please don't. Listen to me, he said with a flash of his old firmness. The estate, all of it, goes to you. The house, the land, the workshop, the investments, everything. Your father gets a cash payout, enough to be fair but not enough to be stupid with. Blake gets the same. But everything else, the things that matter, the things that represent what I built and what I believed in, those go to you. Tears were streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. Why? I asked. Why are you trusting me with all of this? Because you're the only one who will protect it, he said simply. Because you understand that some things are worth more than their market value. Because you've spent your whole life being underestimated and overlooked, and it's time someone showed you that you were the most valuable one all along. Mr. Bennet arrived the next morning with his briefcase and his careful legal language, and he walked me through the will page by page. The house in Charlottesville and its 40-acre property went to me. The workshop and all its tools and contents went to me. The investment portfolio, carefully managed over decades, went to me. The life insurance policy went to me. There were specific bequests for Rosa, generous provisions that would ensure she was taken care of for the rest of her life. And there were cash amounts for my father and Blake, $200,000 each, significant but nowhere near the value of the total estate. Your grandfather has anticipated every possible challenge, Mr. Bennet said. This will has been reviewed by multiple attorneys. His mental competency has been documented by 3 different doctors. He's left detailed letters explaining his reasoning. No court will overturn this, Miss Thompson. This is what he wants, and it's legally unassailable. I looked at Grandpa Walt, who was watching me with clear eyes despite the oxygen tube and the monitors and all the machinery keeping him alive. Are you sure? I asked him. I've never been more sure of anything, he said. He died 2 days later, on a Thursday morning when the autumn light was slanting through the hospital window and painting everything gold. I was holding his hand, and Rosa was sitting on the other side of the bed, and he simply stopped breathing, as peacefully as falling asleep. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, and the world felt instantly, irreversibly smaller. The funeral was the following Monday. It was a large service. Grandpa Walt had been well known in preservation circles, and had friends throughout Virginia. The church was full of people who had worked with him, learned from him, been inspired by his dedication to saving pieces of the past. My father and Blake sat in the front pew, looking appropriately somber. Diane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, though I never saw actual tears. I sat next to Rosa and held her hand through the entire service. The 2 of us united in genuine grief while everyone else performed their expected roles. David had driven down from New York to be with me, and his presence was the only thing keeping me tethered to the present instead of drowning in loss. After the burial, people gathered at the estate for a reception. It was what Grandpa Walt would have wanted, his house filled with people who appreciated craftsmanship and history, who understood what he had spent his life protecting. I moved through the rooms in a fog, accepting condolences from strangers, listening to stories about my grandfather's generosity and wisdom. My father cornered me in the kitchen. We need to talk about the estate, he said without preamble. I've already been in touch with some developers. We should be able to list the property by spring, get it sold before the market shifts. The house will have to be demolished, of course. It's too old to be worth renovating, but the land alone should bring in close to $3 million. I stared at him, incredulous. We just buried him this morning. I know, and I'm grieving too, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But we need to be practical. There are estate taxes to consider, ongoing maintenance costs, market timing. The sooner we move on this, the better for everyone. I'm not selling the estate, I said quietly. He frowned. What do you mean you're not selling? Emma, this isn't your decision to make. I'm the executor. I'll be managing the sale. No, I said. You won't. Something in my voice must have warned him, because his expression shifted from annoyance to concern. What are you talking about? The will reading is tomorrow, I said. Mr. Bennet will explain everything then. I walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the kitchen with confusion hardening into suspicion on his face. I knew what was coming. I knew the next day would shatter whatever remained of my relationship with my father. But standing in Grandpa Walt's house, surrounded by everything he had built and preserved and protected, I felt a clarity I had never experienced before. This was my inheritance. Not just the property and the money, but the responsibility, the calling, the understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when, especially when, everyone else wanted to tear them down. My grandfather had spent his life teaching me that lesson, and tomorrow, at the will reading, I would find out if I had learned it well enough to stand alone. The conference room at Mr. Bennett's office felt smaller than it had when I was there before, as if the walls had contracted overnight to contain what was about to happen. I arrived early, taking the same seat I had occupied during that first shocking moment when I realized how completely my family had written me out of their narrative. But this time, I wasn't the overlooked daughter hoping for scraps of recognition. This time, I knew exactly what was in the folder Mr. Bennett was arranging on the table, and the knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. My father arrived next, Blake trailing behind him. They both wore dark suits, their expressions somber but businesslike, already mentally dividing up assets and calculating values. Diane came in a moment later, followed by my mother, whose presence surprised me. She had been divorced from my father for nearly a decade, and had no legal claim to Grandpa Walt's estate. But apparently someone had invited her, probably out of some misguided sense that the whole family should be present. "Emma," my father said, nodding at me with the bare minimum of acknowledgement. He took the seat at the head of the table as if it were his natural right, as if he were already the patriarch presiding over the division of spoils. Mr. Bennett entered last, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that felt final. He set his briefcase on the table, removed several folders, and arranged them with the careful precision of someone who knew he was about to detonate a bomb, and wanted all the shrapnel contained. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "We're here for the reading of Walter Harrison's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to make clear that this document was prepared with extensive legal review and multiple competency evaluations. Mr. Harrison was of sound mind throughout the entire process, and his wishes are clearly stated and legally binding." My father shifted impatiently. Yes, we understand. Can we proceed?" Mr. Bennett gave him a long look, then opened the first folder. "Very well. Let me begin with the specific bequests. To Rosa Martinez, for 20 years of devoted service and friendship, Mr. Harrison bequeaths the sum of $500,000, the contents of the guest house on the estate property, and a life estate allowing her to live in the guest house for as long as she wishes." There was a sharp intake of breath from Diane, but Mr. Bennett continued without pause. To James Thompson, his son, Mr. Harrison bequeaths the sum of $200,000. The room went very still. My father's face remained impassive, but I saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands flattened against the table. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "Did you say 200,000? "That's correct," Mr. Bennett said. "And the rest?" my father asked, his voice tight. "The house, the land, the workshop, the investments?" Mr. Bennett looked directly at me before answering. To Blake Thompson, his grandson, Mr. Harrison bequeaths the sum of $200,000. Blake's head snapped up, confusion clouding his features. He looked at our father, then at me, trying to understand what was happening. "The remainder of the estate," Mr. Bennett continued, his voice steady and deliberate, "including the residence at 1847, Riverside Drive in Charlottesville, all land and outbuildings associated with that property, the complete contents of the workshop, all investment accounts, stocks, bonds, and securities, and all other assets not specifically bequeathed above, go entirely to Emma Catherine Thompson." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that absorbs sound, that swallows breath, that makes time feel suspended. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear someone's chair creak, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then my father exploded. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising. "That's absolutely impossible. My father would never, he wouldn't, there's been a mistake. You've read the wrong will." "There is no mistake," Mr. Bennett said calmly. "This is the current and valid last will and testament of Walter Harrison, properly executed and witnessed. She manipulated him, my father said, pointing at me. His face had gone red, a vein pulsing at his temple. She spent years worming her way into his good graces, poisoning him against his own son, convincing him to do this. It's elder abuse. It's undue influence. We'll contest it. We'll have it thrown out. You're welcome to try, Mr. Bennet said. However, I should inform you that Mr. Harrison anticipated this reaction and took extensive precautions. We have documented proof of his mental competency from 3 independent physicians, all dated within the last 6 months. We have video recordings of him explaining his reasoning. We have a paper trail going back more than a decade showing his consistent intentions regarding the disposition of his estate. Any contest would be unsuccessful and expensive. Why? Blake asked, and his voice sounded younger somehow, almost childlike. Why would Grandpa do this? Mr. Bennet pulled out another folder. Your grandfather left letters for each of you, explaining his decisions in his own words. If you'd like, I can read them now, or I can provide you with copies to review privately. Read mine, my father demanded. I want to hear exactly what lies she convinced him to write. Mr. Bennet opened the letter addressed to my father, and began to read in a steady, professional tone that somehow made the words even more devastating. James, if you're hearing this, I'm gone and you're angry. I know you are. You've been counting on this inheritance for years, making plans, making promises to developers, living beyond your means in anticipation of the windfall you believed was coming. But son, I need you to understand something. I'm not giving the bulk of my estate to Emma to punish you. I'm doing it because she's the only one who will protect what I've built. My father's face had gone from red to white, his hands clenched into fists on the table. You've spent your career tearing down the things I spent my life trying to save, Mr. Bennet continued reading. Every time I preserved a historic building, you saw it as a lost opportunity for profit. Every time I argued for conservation, you dismissed it as sentimentality. We've had fundamentally different values, James, and I've accepted that. But I will not, allow my life's work to be demolished the moment I'm in the ground. The letter went on, detailing specific instances where my father had pressured Grandpa Walt to sell the estate, had brought developers to the property without permission, had tried to convince him that preservation was a waste of resources. It laid out, in my grandfather's careful handwriting, a lifetime of philosophical differences and disappointed hopes. Emma understands what this place means, the letter concluded. She understands that value isn't always measured in dollars. She has the education, the dedication, and the integrity to ensure that my legacy continues. I'm not leaving her this estate because I love you less. I'm leaving it to her because I trust her more. I hope someday you'll understand the difference. When Mr. Bennet finished reading, my father sat motionless, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. Then slowly he turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was one of pure hatred. You did this, he said, his voice low and venomous. You spent years playing the victim, the overlooked daughter, all while scheming to steal my inheritance. I didn't steal anything, I said, finding my voice despite the trembling in my hands. Grandpa Walt made his own choices based on his own values. Values? My father spat. You want to talk about values? What about family loyalty? What about respecting your father? What about the fact that I'm his son, his only son, and I earned the right to inherit his estate? You didn't earn anything, I said, and the words came out stronger than I expected. You spent your whole life dismissing everything Grandpa Walt cared about. You wanted to tear down his house and sell his land to developers. You saw his life's work as nothing more than a commodity to liquidate. Why would he give you something you planned to destroy? How dare you? Diane interjected, her voice sharp. Your father has worked his entire life to build his business, to provide for this family. You have no right to judge his choices. And yet Grandpa Walt did judge them, I said, looking at her directly. He judged them and found them lacking. That's not my fault. That's the consequence of my father's own actions. Blake had been quiet through all of this, his face pale, his eyes moving between me and our father. Did you know? He asked me suddenly. Before he died, did you know he was leaving everything to you? Yes, I said, because lying would have been pointless. He told me. He wanted me to be prepared. And you didn't think to mention it? Blake's voice was rising now, anger replacing confusion. You didn't think maybe the rest of us should know that we were about to be cut out of our grandfather's will? It wasn't my secret to tell, I said. And Grandpa Walt had his reasons for keeping his plans private. He knew exactly what would happen if Dad found out before he died. There would have been pressure, arguments, attempts to change his mind. He wanted to make his decision without interference. So you let us go to the funeral thinking we were equals, Blake said. You let us grieve like we were all the same amount of family to him, knowing the whole time that you were the favorite, the chosen one, the only one who mattered. I never said I was the favorite. I protested, but even as I said it, I knew it was true. I had been Grandpa Walt's favorite, not because I manipulated him or schemed for his affection, but because I was the only one who shared his values, who understood what he was trying to preserve. This is unbelievable, my father said, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. You're not going to get away with this, Emma. I'll fight this will with everything I have. I'll drag you through courts for years. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are, a conniving, manipulative. Mr. Thompson, Mr. Bennett interrupted firmly. I strongly advise against making threats. As I mentioned, this will is uncontestable. Any legal challenge would be frivolous and would likely result in sanctions. Furthermore, your father included a clause stating that anyone who contests the will forfeits their bequest entirely. If you proceed with a challenge, you'll lose the $200,000. My father's mouth opened and closed, his face cycling through several shades of red and purple. Fine, he said finally. Keep your blood money, Emma. Keep the house and the land and all of it. But don't ever expect to be part of this family again. You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with the consequences. I can live with the consequences, I said quietly. Can you? He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his eyes, a final severing of whatever thin connection had remained between us. Then he turned and walked out of the conference room, Diane following quickly behind him. Blake hesitated, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between betrayal and understanding. Then he too left, leaving just my mother, Mr. Bennett, and me in the suddenly cavernous room. My mother, who had been silent through the entire exchange, spoke for the first time. Emma, sweetheart, you have to understand how this looks. Your father has a point. From the outside, it does seem like you influenced your grandfather's decision. Mom, I said, and my voice was tired, drained of the adrenaline that had kept me upright through the confrontation. I spent my entire childhood being overlooked. I paid my own way through college while Blake's education was fully funded. I sent money home for years while nobody ever asked if I needed help. I've been on the outside of this family my whole life, and the one time someone chose to put me first, you're telling me it looks bad? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, I thought I saw something like recognition in her eyes, an acknowledgement of all the ways she had failed to see me, failed to advocate for me, failed to question why one child was celebrated while the other was ignored. But then she looked away, and I knew that whatever moment of clarity she might have had was gone. I should go check on your father, she said, gathering her purse. He's very upset. But Emma, I do hope you'll reconsider. Family is more important than money or property. Maybe you could work out some kind of arrangement, share the estate, something that would make everyone happy. Grandpa Walt already made the arrangement that would make him happy, I said. I'm going to honor his wishes. She nodded, but I could see she didn't understand, didn't want to understand. She left, and then it was just Mr. Bennett and me in the conference room with the remains of my family's implosion scattered around us like debris. That was difficult, Mr. Bennett said, his professional composure showing the first small cracks. I've been practicing law for 35 years, and will readings never get easier, especially when families fracture like this. Did Grandpa Walt know it would be this bad? I asked. He knew, Mr. Bennett said. He talked about it extensively. He felt enormous guilt about putting you in this position, but he also felt it was the right thing to do. He said you were strong enough to handle it, that you'd been handling difficult things your whole life, and this was just one more challenge you'd overcome. I thought about that, about my grandfather's faith in my resilience, and I felt tears building behind my eyes for the first time since the will reading had begun. I miss him, I said simply. I know, Mr. Bennet said kindly. He was a remarkable man. And Emma, for what it's worth, I think he made the right choice. I've seen what happens when estates go to people who don't value them. The properties get sold, the money gets spent, and within a generation, there's nothing left to show that the person ever existed. What your grandfather left you is a responsibility, yes, but it's also a gift. The gift of purpose, of meaningful work, of a legacy worth protecting. We spent the next hour going over the practical details of the inheritance. There were documents to sign, accounts to transfer, tax implications to discuss. Mr. Bennet explained that the estate was actually worth more than I had realized. In addition to the property and the house, there were investment accounts that Grandpa Walt had been carefully managing for decades, a portfolio of stocks and bonds that generated steady income. The total value was somewhere around $4.5 million, not counting the property itself, which was probably worth another $2 million. You're a wealthy woman, Ms. Thompson, Mr. Bennet said. Not extravagantly wealthy, but certainly comfortable enough that you'll never have to worry about money if you're careful. Your grandfather set up a trust structure that will minimize tax burden and provide you with steady income. You can continue your studies, pursue your career in preservation, maintain the estate, all without financial stress. I tried to wrap my mind around those numbers, but they felt abstract, unreal. I had spent so many years counting every dollar, stretching every paycheck, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. The idea that I was suddenly financially secure felt like a dream I hadn't dared to have. There's one more thing, Mr. Bennet said, pulling out a final envelope. Your grandfather left this for you. He said to give it to you after the will reading, after everything was official. He wanted you to read it when you were alone. I took the envelope, my name written on it in Grandpa Walt's familiar handwriting. I tucked it into my bag, knowing I would need privacy to read whatever final message he had left for me. I left Mr. Bennet's office and walked out into the Richmond afternoon. The city looked the same as it always had, historic buildings standing alongside modern construction, the old and the new coexisting in a way Grandpa Walt would have appreciated. I got in my car and started driving, not toward my father's house where I had been staying, but toward Charlottesville, toward the estate that was now mine. The drive took 40 minutes, and I spent them in a kind of numb silence, my mind unable to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts and calls that I ignored. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to explain or defend or justify. I just wanted to be in the place where I had always felt most at home, the place where my grandfather had taught me to see value in things other people overlooked. When I pulled up to the estate, Rosa was waiting on the front porch. She must have gotten the news from Mr. Bennet, must have known I would come here. She stood and opened her arms, and I walked into them and finally let myself cry, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body. She held me and murmured in Spanish, comforting words I didn't need to understand to feel their meaning. He was so proud of you, she said when I finally quieted. So proud of who you became, of your strength, of your integrity. He wanted you to have this place because he knew you would love it the way he loved it. We went inside, and the house welcomed me the way it always had, with the smell of old wood and lemon polish, and the particular quality of light that came through the original windows. I walked through the rooms, touching familiar furniture, running my hand along the banister Grandpa Walt had restored, standing in the workshop where he had taught me so much. Later, sitting in his study with a cup of tea Rosa had made, I opened the final letter. His handwriting was shakier than usual, evidence that he had written this in his final days, but the words were clear and deliberate. My dearest Emma, the letter began. If you're reading this, then the will has been read and you know the truth about your inheritance. I can imagine how the rest of the family reacted, and I'm sorry for putting you through that. But I'm not sorry for my decision. You are exactly the person I hoped you would become. Someone who understands that the best things in life can't be bought or sold, only preserved and protected and passed on to the next person who will value them properly. The letter continued, telling me stories about the house, about specific pieces in the workshop, about his hopes for how I would use the property. He suggested I might turn part of the estate into a teaching center for preservation techniques, a place where young craftspeople could learn the skills that were disappearing. He talked about the garden and how my grandmother had planted every rose bush, how they should be pruned in early spring and fed in summer. But more than anything, he wrote near the end, I want you to understand that this inheritance isn't just about property or money. It's about identity. Your father has spent his whole life trying to be someone he's not, chasing success that never satisfies him because it's not built on authentic values. You, Emma, have always known who you are, even when no one else saw it. This estate is yours because you're the only one who will use it to become more fully yourself, to do work that matters, to build a life of meaning rather than just accumulation. The letter ended with a paragraph that made me cry all over again. I know your father will say terrible things. I know he'll try to make you feel guilty or selfish or wrong for accepting this inheritance. Don't listen to him. You didn't take anything from him that was rightfully his. You received something that was rightfully yours all along. Recognition of your worth, investment in your future, and faith in your ability to carry forward something bigger than yourself. Be proud of who you are, Emma. I certainly am. I sat in his study until the light faded and Rosa came to tell me she had made dinner. We ate together in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, just the two of us sharing a simple meal and talking about Grandpa Walt, about our favorite memories, about the future of the estate. What will you do? Rosa asked. With the house, with everything? I'm going to keep it, I said. I'm going to finish my degree at Columbia, but I'll come back here on breaks and summers. Eventually, maybe I'll move back permanently, turn the place into what Grandpa Walt envisioned, a center for preservation education. But first, I need to learn more, need to build my own expertise so I can do justice to his legacy. He would like that, Rosa said, smiling. He always said you were a better student than any of his apprentices, because you asked better questions. I stayed at the estate that night, sleeping in one of the guest rooms, and for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and I could hear Rosa moving around downstairs, already starting her day. I got up and dressed and went down to the workshop. Standing in the space where Grandpa Walt had spent so many hours, surrounded by his tools and his projects and his carefully organized supplies, I felt a sense of purpose settle over me. This was my responsibility now. This was my legacy to protect and my future to build. My father could be angry. Blake could feel betrayed. The rest of the family could whisper about manipulation and undue influence. None of it mattered because I knew the truth. I hadn't stolen this inheritance. I had earned it, not through scheming or manipulation, but through years of paying attention, of learning, of caring about the things that mattered. Grandpa Walt had seen something in me that my father had always overlooked. Not potential for profit, but capacity for purpose. I picked up one of his favorite tools, a hand plane that had belonged to his own grandfather, and felt the weight of generations in my palm. Then I set it back down carefully and walked out of the workshop, ready to return to New York, ready to finish my degree, ready to build the life that would honor my grandfather's faith in me. David was waiting when I got back to my apartment in Washington Heights. He had given me space during the will reading and its aftermath, but when I called to say I was on my way home, he had asked if I wanted company. I said yes, and now he was there with takeout from my favorite Thai place, and a willingness to listen to whatever I needed to say. I told him everything. The whole story of the will reading, my father's rage, Blake's betrayal, the letter from Grandpa Walt. He listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything, just being present while I processed everything that had happened. So you're rich now, he said when I finally paused. I laughed, surprising myself. I guess I am. It doesn't feel real. What are you going to do? Finish school, I said. Keep working. Honor his legacy. Try not to feel guilty about having something my father wanted. You don't have anything to feel guilty about, David said firmly. Your grandfather made a choice based on his values and his assessment of who would be the best steward of his life's work. That's not about punishment or favoritism. It's about responsibility. I know, I said. But knowing it and feeling it are different things. They'll get easier, he said. Give it time. Over the next few months, time did make things easier, though not in the ways I expected. My father stopped calling, stopped texting, cut me off completely as he had threatened to do. Blake tried to maintain contact for a while, sending occasional messages that were equal parts accusation and plea for understanding, but eventually those stopped too. My mother continued to reach out sporadically, always with the same message that I should try to reconcile with my father. That family was more important than money, that surely we could work something out. I stopped responding to those messages. There was nothing to work out. Grandpa Walt had made his decision, and I was going to honor it. If that meant losing the family I had never really belonged to anyway, then so be it. Instead, I focused on building the life I wanted. I threw myself into my studies at Columbia, working on a thesis about mid-Atlantic preservation techniques. I spent weekends with David exploring New York's architectural treasures. I made plans for the Charlottesville estate, sketching out ideas for how to transform the workshop into a teaching space, researching grant opportunities for historic preservation education. And every Sunday, I called Rosa, and we talked about the property, about maintenance issues and garden progress and her plans for the guest house. She had become my partner in managing the estate, the person I trusted to keep everything running while I finished my degree. 6 months after the will reading, Mr. Bennett called to tell me that my father had indeed filed a contest, claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. It's going nowhere, he assured me. We have so much documentation that the judge will probably dismiss it at the first hearing. But I wanted you to know it's happening. The contest was dismissed within 3 months, just as Mr. Bennett had predicted. My father was ordered to pay court costs and attorney's fees, and the judge included a strongly worded statement in his ruling about frivolous litigation and the importance of respecting testamentary wishes. It was a complete vindication of Grandpa Walt's planning, and a final confirmation that the inheritance was legally and morally mine. I waited to feel triumphant, but instead, I just felt sad. Sad that my father had wasted money and time on a challenge he couldn't win. Sad that he couldn't accept his own father's decision. Sad that our family had fractured so completely over something that should have been an occasion for honoring a life well lived. But beneath the sadness was something else, a growing sense of freedom. I had spent my whole life trying to earn my family's recognition, working harder, achieving more, hoping that someday they would see me the way Grandpa Walt had seen me. The inheritance and everything that followed had finally taught me that their recognition was never going to come, and more importantly, that I didn't need it. I graduated from Columbia with honors, my thesis on preservation techniques earning praise from my professors and interest from several preservation organizations. I was offered a job with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a position that would allow me to work on projects across the country while being based in Washington, D.C., close enough to Charlottesville to manage the estate on weekends. David and I had been talking about the future, about what it would mean if I moved to D.C., about whether he would come with me. He was offered a position with a structural engineering firm that specialized in historic buildings, based in Arlington, and suddenly our future was aligning in ways that felt both exciting and terrifying. On a weekend trip to Charlottesville to check on the estate, David and I were walking through the garden when he stopped in front of the rose bushes my grandmother had planted. "Emma," he said, and something in his voice made my heart start racing. "I've been thinking about what your grandfather wrote in that letter, about building a life of meaning, about becoming more fully yourself." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple and beautiful, with a stone the color of the sky. "I want to build that life with you," he said. "Not because of the estate or the money or any of that. Because you're the most authentic person I've ever met, and being with you makes me want to be more authentic too. Will you marry me?" I said yes, and when we called Rosa to tell her, she cried happy tears and said Grandpa Walt would have been so pleased. We set a date for the following spring, planning a small ceremony at the estate with just close friends and the family we had chosen rather than the family we had been born into. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, the kind of clear April morning that made everything feel possible. We were married in the garden, surrounded by my grandmother's roses and people who genuinely cared about us. Rosa served as my matron of honor. David's brother was his best man. My Columbia professors came, and colleagues from the National Trust, and friends we had made in New York. My father and Blake were not invited, and their absence felt appropriate rather than painful. My mother came, though she spent most of the reception commenting on how nice it would have been if the whole family could have been there, if I had just been willing to compromise. I let her words wash over me without taking them in, focused instead on the life I was celebrating, the partnership I was beginning, the future I was building. After the wedding, David and I spent our honeymoon traveling through New England, documenting historic properties and dreaming about the preservation center we would eventually create in Charlottesville. We talked about bringing in master craftspeople to teach workshops, about hosting summer programs for students interested in traditional building techniques, about creating a resource library for preservation research. Everything Grandpa Walt had envisioned, everything he had trusted me to build, was starting to take shape. And as we drove back to D.C., at the end of our honeymoon, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the inheritance, but for the man who had seen my worth when no one else did, who had invested in my future when no one else would, who had taught me that the most valuable things in life are the ones we preserve and protect and pass on to the next generation. The will reading had been the moment when my family called me worthless, and the lawyer revealed I was the beneficiary. But the real inheritance, I understood now, wasn't the money or the property. It was the knowledge that I had value independent of anyone else's recognition, that my worth was inherent rather than assigned, that I was capable of carrying forward something meaningful. My grandfather had given me more than an estate. He had given me permission to be exactly who I was, and the resources to build a life that honored that authentic self. And in the end, that was the most valuable inheritance anyone could receive. 3 years after the will reading, I stood in the workshop that had been transformed into the Walter Harrison Center for Preservation Arts. The space still smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, but now it was filled with workbenches where students were learning traditional joinery techniques from master craftspeople Rosa and I had brought in from across the country. Sunlight streamed through the windows Grandpa Walt had installed decades ago, illuminating hands working wood with the same patience and attention he had taught me. David was in the main house, meeting with architects about the renovation plans for the old carriage house. We were converting it into residential space for visiting fellows, scholars and practitioners who would come for intensive study periods. The grant money had come through from the National Trust, along with funding from 2 private foundations that recognized the value of what we were building. The center was becoming exactly what Grandpa Walt had envisioned, a place where knowledge was passed down, where craftsmanship mattered more than speed, where the past was honored as a foundation for the future. I walked through the workshop, pausing to watch a young woman carefully fitting a mortise and tenon joint. She was a graduate student from Virginia Tech, spending her summer learning skills that weren't taught in modern architecture programs. Her face held the same expression of focused concentration I remembered seeing in the mirror when I was her age, working beside my grandfather on some forgotten Saturday afternoon. "How's it coming?" I asked, and she looked up with a smile that was equal parts pride and frustration. "It's harder than it looks," she said. "I've cut this tenon 3 times and it's still not quite right. But I'm getting closer." "That's how you know you're learning," I told her. "If it was easy, it wouldn't be worth doing." The words were my grandfather's, passed through me to her, a chain of knowledge that would continue long after I was gone. My phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. She was at the main house preparing lunch for the students and staff, a role she had taken on with enthusiasm once the center opened. The guest house where she lived had been renovated with her input, transformed into a comfortable home that she would occupy for as long as she wanted. She had become not just my partner in running the estate, but family in the truest sense, the kind that's chosen rather than inherited. I walked from the workshop to the main house, following the stone path that wound through gardens my grandmother had planted and I had restored. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the June air. We had added new plantings too, heritage varieties that were historically appropriate to the property, creating a living laboratory for landscape preservation students. Inside, the house hummed with purposeful activity. The formal dining room had been converted into a research library, shelves lined with books on architectural history and preservation techniques. The parlor served as a gathering space where students and instructors could discuss projects and share ideas. Grandpa Walt's study remained largely unchanged, A private space I retreated to when I needed to think or write or simply remember the man who had made all of this possible. Rosa had set out lunch in the kitchen. The same kitchen where she had made me tea on that first devastating day after the will reading. Now it was filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter as students gathered to eat and exchange stories about their morning's work. David joined us, sliding into the chair beside me and stealing a bite from my plate in the comfortable way of long marriage. The carriage house architect has some interesting ideas, he said. Wants to preserve the original structure, but modernize the mechanical systems. I think Grandpa Walt would approve. I smiled at his easy use of Grandpa Walt, as if my grandfather had been his own. In a way, he had been. David had never met him, but he had absorbed his philosophy through me, through the estate, through the work we were doing together. He understood instinctively what my father never had. That preservation wasn't about clinging to the past but about learning from it, honoring it, carrying it forward in ways that enriched the future. After lunch, I retreated to the study to work on the quarterly newsletter we sent to donors and supporters. The center had been operating for 2 years now, and the response had exceeded our most optimistic projections. We had a waiting list of students wanting to attend workshops. We had craftspeople from around the world applying to be visiting instructors. We had universities reaching out about partnership opportunities. What had started as my grandfather's quiet mission to save one piece of architectural heritage had grown into something that was influencing preservation education across the region. I was writing about our upcoming fall workshop series when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, but something made me answer. "Emma Thompson," I said. "Emma, it's Blake." My brother's voice, unexpected after 3 years of silence, made my hand tighten around the phone. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Not about the will or the money or any of that. About something else." I waited, not sure what to say, not sure I wanted to reopen a door that had closed so completely. "Dad had a heart attack," Blake continued, his voice strained. "Last week. He's okay, he's going to recover, but it was serious. And Emma, he's different now. Scared in a way I've never seen him. He's been talking about regrets, about things he wishes he'd done differently. He asked about you." "What did he ask?" I said carefully. "He asked if I thought you'd ever forgive him. For the way he treated you, for the things he said after Grandpa died. He didn't say he wanted to apologize, not exactly, but I think he's starting to understand what he lost. Not the inheritance He's starting to understand that he lost his daughter." I sat in my grandfather's chair looking at the photograph on the desk of Walt and me in the workshop, both of us smiling, covered in sawdust, content in our shared purpose. "I don't know what to say, Blake. I've built a life here. A good life. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm also not interested in going backward." "I'm not asking you to go backward," Blake said. I wanted you to know. In case it mattered. And Emma, I need to say something too. I was wrong. About all of it. I was so caught up in being Dad's son, in living up to his expectations, that I never questioned whether those expectations were worth meeting. Grandpa Walt saw something in you that the rest of us missed. He saw that you had your own compass, your own values, and you weren't going to compromise them for anyone's approval. His voice cracked slightly. "I've been watching what you're doing with the estate. I follow the center's website. I see the workshops you're offering, the students you're teaching, the way you've honored his vision. And I realize now that you didn't steal anything from me. You earned something I never deserved." "Blake," I said, and my throat felt tight. "You could have earned it too. You could have spent time with him, learned from him, shown interest in what he cared about. It wasn't about being perfect or chosen. It was about paying attention." "I know that now," he said. "Too late, but I know it. I'm trying to figure out who I am outside of Dad's expectations. It's harder than I thought it would be. I spent so long being the golden child that I never developed my own identity." We talked for another 20 minutes, a real conversation for the first time in our adult lives. He told me about leaving our father's company, about going back to school for a degree in environmental science, about trying to build a career that meant something to him rather than something that impressed our father. I told him about the center, about David, about the life I had created in Charlottesville. When we hung up, I sat in the study for a long time, processing the call. I didn't know if Blake and I would rebuild a relationship. I didn't know if my father's near-death realization would lead to any real change, or just fade away as his health improved. But I also realized that none of it changed what I had built. My worth wasn't dependent on their recognition. My success wasn't validated by their approval. My choices didn't require their understanding. That evening, I told David about the call. We were sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set over the property, the workshop silhouetted against the orange sky. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. I don't need closure from them. I don't need an apology or an explanation or a reconciliation. I have everything I need right here. "But if Blake reaches out again?" David pressed gently. "Then I'll respond," I said. "But on my terms. Not because I owe him anything or because family means we have to pretend the past didn't happen. If he's genuinely changed, if he's building his own life based on his own values, then maybe we can have some kind of relationship. But it won't be the relationship of our childhood. That's gone, and I'm okay with that." David nodded, understanding in the way he always did. We sat in comfortable silence, watching darkness settle over the estate, lights beginning to glow in the workshop where evening classes were starting. The sound of voices drifted across the garden, students discussing techniques and sharing discoveries. This was my family now, this community of people who cared about preservation and craftsmanship and passing knowledge to the next generation. A month later, I received a letter from my father. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter, the first piece of personal correspondence he had sent me in 3 years. I held it for a long time before opening it, unsure if I was ready for whatever was inside. Finally, sitting in the study with afternoon light slanting across the desk, I unfolded the pages. The letter was not an apology, not exactly. It was more like an accounting, a listing of regrets without quite taking full responsibility for them. He wrote about the heart attack, about the fear he had felt, about the sudden awareness of his own mortality. He wrote about my mother's divorce, about how he had blamed her for leaving rather than examining his own role in the marriage's failure. He wrote about Blake's decision to leave the company, about feeling abandoned and betrayed, about not understanding why his son would walk away from the business he had built. And then near the end he wrote about me. "I've been thinking about the things I said at the will reading," he wrote. "About the accusations I made. I was angry, Emma. Angry at my father for what felt like a betrayal. Angry at you for being the recipient of something I thought should be mine. But I've had time to think, and I realize now that my father didn't betray me. He simply valued different things than I do, and he saw those values reflected in you." The letter continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect us to have a relationship like we might have had if I'd been a better father. But I want you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You've done something remarkable with the estate. You've honored my father's vision in ways I never would have. And I'm starting to understand that maybe that was the point. Maybe he left it to you not to punish me but to preserve something that mattered to him more than money or family loyalty. Maybe he left it to you because you were the only one who would love it the way he did." The letter ended without asking for anything, no request for reconciliation or forgiveness, just a statement that he had written what he needed to say, and now it was up to me what to do with it. I folded the pages and put them back in the envelope, then placed the envelope in the desk drawer with the final letter from Grandpa Walt. 2 letters from 2 men, one who had seen my worth and one who was only beginning to recognize it. I didn't respond immediately. I sat with the letter for weeks, reading it occasionally, thinking about what, if anything, I wanted to say back. David encouraged me to take my time, to not feel pressured to respond in any particular way or timeline. "This is about what you need," he reminded me. "Not about what he needs or what Blake thinks you should do, or what anyone else expects. You get to decide what kind of relationship, if any, you want with your father." In the end I wrote back. A short letter, professional in tone, acknowledging his words but not absolving him. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but that I wasn't ready for more than cordial distance. I told him about the center's success, about the students we were teaching, about the preservation work happening across the estate. I told him I hoped his health continued to improve, and that he would find whatever peace he was looking for. And I signed it simply Emma. His response came quickly, a brief note thanking me for writing back and expressing interest in seeing the center sometime. I didn't invite him, but I didn't refuse either. I left the possibility open, a door not closed but not fully opened either. Something that might someday lead to a different kind of relationship but wasn't urgent or necessary. Blake, on the other hand, became a more regular presence in my life. He started visiting every few months, coming to Charlottesville on weekends to see what we were doing with the estate. He took workshops at the center, learning woodworking and masonry repair, skills he said helped him understand what Grandpa Walt had been trying to teach us all those years. He and David became friendly, bonding over their shared experience of trying to build identities separate from family expectations. During one of Blake's visits, he brought someone with him, a woman named Jennifer who taught environmental policy at UVA. She was smart and thoughtful and clearly cared about him in a way that seemed healthy and genuine. Watching them together, I saw glimpses of the person Blake might have become if he hadn't spent so many years trying to be what our father wanted. "I'm sorry," Blake said to me one evening when we were alone in the garden. "For everything. For not standing up for you when we were kids. For going along with Dad's narrative about you being the problem. For buying into the idea that his approval was worth more than having a real relationship with my sister. You were a kid too," I said, because it was true. "You were just responding to the same system I was trapped in. You got the rewards, I got the neglect, but neither of us was really seen for who we actually were." "Still," he said, "I should have questioned it. Should have wondered why you were always overlooked. Should have shared some of what I was given. I had opportunities to be a better brother, and I didn't take them." "You're taking them now," I pointed out. "That matters." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the roses my grandmother had planted bloom in the twilight. "Do you think Dad will ever really change?" Blake asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think he's capable of recognizing his mistakes. I'm less sure he's capable of doing the work to be different. But Blake, that's not our responsibility. We can't fix him or save him or make him into the father we needed. All we can do is decide what kind of relationship we're willing to have with who he actually is." "What kind of relationship are you willing to have?" he asked. "Distant but not hostile," I said after thinking about it. "Polite but not intimate. I'm not interested in pretending the past didn't happen, but I'm also not interested in staying angry forever. Anger takes energy, and I'd rather spend that energy on what I'm building here." Blake nodded slowly. "I'm trying to get to that place. Right now I'm still pretty angry. At him for what he did to you, to Mom, to both of us in different ways. At myself for not seeing it sooner." "That's okay," I said. "You're allowed to be angry. Just don't let the anger become your whole identity. Don't let him take up so much space in your head that there's no room left for figuring out who you want to be." It was advice Grandpa Walt had given me years ago, though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. Now, with the perspective that came from building my own life, I saw its wisdom. My father had taken up enormous space in my psyche for years. His approval the thing I chased, his neglect the wound I couldn't heal. It was only by releasing him, by accepting that he would never be the father I needed, that I had been able to become fully myself. The center continued to grow and evolve. We added new programs, established partnerships with universities and preservation organizations, brought in speakers and scholars from around the world. The carriage house renovation was completed, providing beautiful accommodation for visiting fellows. The gardens became a destination for landscape historians, studying heritage plants and traditional garden design. The workshop produced graduates who went on to work on significant preservation projects across the country. And through it all, I felt my grandfather's presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living influence. The values he had taught me, the skills he had passed on, the vision he had articulated, all of it was bearing fruit in ways that exceeded anything I could have imagined. The estate wasn't a museum, frozen in time. It was a living, working space where the past informed the present and prepared people for the future. 5 years after the will reading, the center hosted a symposium on Mid-Atlantic preservation techniques. Scholars and practitioners came from across the country, filling the estate with conversation and debate, and the kind of intellectual energy Grandpa Walt would have loved. During the opening reception, I stood in the garden and looked at what we had built, the restored buildings, the thriving programs, the community of people dedicated to preservation. Rosa found me there, standing alone with a glass of wine, watching the crowd mingle. "You would be so proud," she said, slipping her arm through mine. "I hope so," I said. "I know so," she corrected. "Emma, you've done more than preserve his estate. You've amplified his mission. You've taken what he started and made it bigger, more influential, more impactful than it ever could have been in his lifetime. That's the best kind of legacy." David joined us, and the three of us stood together watching the party. My chosen family, I thought. The people who saw me and valued me and supported me not because they had to but because they wanted to. This was what love looked like when it was freely given rather than conditionally withheld. Later that night, after the guests had left and the estate was quiet again, I went to the study and pulled out the two letters, the one from Grandpa Walt and the one from my father. I read them both, seeing the contrast between a man who had spent his life recognizing value in overlooked things and a man who was only beginning to learn that lesson. I thought about worth, about how we measure it, about who gets to decide what matters. My father had measured worth in dollars and status, and the kind of success that looked impressive from the outside. Grandpa Walt had measured worth in integrity and dedication, and the willingness to preserve something beautiful even when it wasn't profitable. For most of my life, I had been judged by my father's metrics and found wanting. It had taken my grandfather's death and the inheritance that followed to finally understand that I had been using the wrong measuring stick all along. I put the letters away and turned off the light, walking through the house that was now mine in every sense. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the same sounds my grandfather must have heard when he walked these halls. The moonlight came through the original windows, casting the same patterns on the walls that had been there for generations. I was the steward of this place now, the keeper of its history, the person responsible for ensuring it would survive for the next generation. It was a responsibility I had never asked for, but had spent my whole life preparing to accept. And standing in the quiet house, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle comfortably on my shoulders, I knew that Grandpa Walt had been right. I was exactly the person who should have received this inheritance. Not because I was better than my father or Blake, not because I was more deserving in some cosmic sense, but because I was the one who would love it properly, protect it fiercely, and pass it on with the same care it had been given to me. The journey from overlooked daughter to estate owner had been painful and complicated, marked by betrayal and loss and the severing of family ties. But it had also been a journey toward becoming more fully myself, toward understanding my own worth independent of anyone else's validation, toward building a life that reflected my values rather than conforming to someone else's expectations. At the will reading, they had called me worthless, a daughter not worth a penny, someone who had been written out of the family narrative. But the lawyer had revealed a different truth, that my grandfather had seen my worth all along, had been investing in my future even when no one else believed I had won, had trusted me with his legacy because he knew I would honor it. And I had. The center was proof of that, as were the students I taught and the projects I oversaw and the community I had built. This was my inheritance, not just the property and the money, but the opportunity to do work that mattered, to preserve things worth saving, to pass knowledge to the next generation, to build a life of purpose and meaning. My father's voice was still there sometimes, in the back of my mind, questioning my choices and suggesting I had taken something that wasn't rightfully mine. But it was quieter now, drowned out by the voices of students in the workshop and colleagues at conferences, and David beside me in bed discussing plans for the future. The narrative I had grown up with, that I was less important, less valuable, less worthy of investment and attention, had been replaced by a different story, one where I was capable and competent, where my work mattered, where my worth was inherent rather than assigned. Standing in my grandfather's house, surrounded by everything he had built and trusted me to protect, I understood that this was what inheritance really meant. Not the transfer of assets or the distribution of wealth, but the passing on of values, the continuation of vision, the belief that someone else will carry forward what you've started and make it even better than you imagined. Grandpa Walt had given me that gift, the gift of being seen and valued and believed in. and I had honored it by becoming exactly who he knew I could be. Not worthless, as my father had claimed, but priceless in the truest sense. Not because of what I owned or what I had inherited, but because of what I had learned and what I was building and what I would someday pass on to the next person who needed to hear that their worth wasn't determined by other people's inability to recognize it. The estate would outlive me, just as it had outlived my grandfather. The work would continue long after I was gone. But for now, it was mine to steward, mine to protect, mine to use as a foundation for doing work that mattered. And that was the best inheritance anyone could ask for. The opportunity to build a life that reflected their values, surrounded by people who saw their worth, doing work that would echo forward through generations. In the end, the will reading hadn't just been about money or property. It had been about recognition, about validation, about a grandfather who loved me enough to ensure I would have everything I needed to become who I was meant to be. They had called me worthless, but he had proven them wrong in the most definitive way possible. And now, living in his house and continuing his mission, I proved it wrong every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.